want to bring to you today some of the most persistent myths about creativity and try to get those out of our lives, okay? Because a lot of these are very harmful and they inhibit a lot of creativity, and they also sort of try to tell us wrongly who is creative and who can be creative. So that's kind of the big ticket items for today. So, what is creativity, right? The idea of creativity being sort of a rebellious act is very interesting and very much aligned with a lot of the research on creativity. And just the sheer joy of being creative, the empowering feelings, the excitement that goes with it. Creativity is a groundbreaking thing. We've never seen something like it before. That zigzagging path, tinkering, asking what if, and of course, the vulnerability that creativity demands of the person doing that type of act. And then, of course, fusing things together really is one of the key items with any kind of creative breakthroughs. So we got these words that we see have such a sprawling, wide sort of array of definitions and terms, but we get into these creative myths, and actually they hold us too tightly in so many wrong ways. And one of the best ways to enter and discover some of these myths is this book right here called The Myths of Creativity by David Burkus. So a great deal of the research aligns with what he's saying, but he wrote such a friendly book, so easy to read, so story-like, and he takes us through about 8 or 9, 10 of these myths. So we're going to focus on just a few of those that are drawn not only from his book, from other examples and research too. So the first one we're going to dive into is called the breed myth. One of the most persistent myths about creativity is that it's just one particular type of person, usually the arts person, that is the creator, creative thinker, and everyone else, they just go about their day and they do their lives in a different way. And it couldn't be more untrue. So the question is, who can be creative? Well, that would be all of us. It really doesn't matter the domain. It doesn't matter the discipline. So it's an office. It's out on the hospital work floor with a nurse or a surgeon, or perhaps it is in the arts. And that's something that's really great about the STEAM Festival, including the arts inside of that conversation. So let's give you an example of one of my favorite artistic creative pieces from an artist trying to tell the history of a specific genre of music. So this is a electrical circuitry map leveraged as a way to tell the history of the art form that is known as hip hop. This is one of the most striking things I've seen regarding creativity. I mean, look at this, the fusion of a blueprinting circuitry map overlaid to tell the history of that art form. And you can see that the detail here is incredible. This person's left maybe nothing out. They've done their homework for sure. And so if you zoom in, you can start to see some of the specific trend lines and patterns and power lines on how these ideas started, where they went to next. Over here, starting in New York City, late 70s, early 80s. And then, of course, you get into the 80s, you see some of your big ticket items there, some of your major players, but also some of the ones that are kind of hiding there in the backgrounds. And then, of course, don't forget about other moments of creativity too. It's not just for the arts. That's one of the big myths, is that it's just these artistic folks. But actually, the art is only one dimension. So let's go over to where I grew up, which is on a construction site. So my family is a drywall family, and this was really my first brush with creativity, is watching my brother and my father build, construct, and craft and solve problems and ask what if. And so we learned from an early age from my father to try to answer this question: what are you going to do that's just a little bit different? And that's what he wanted for us when we went out and started our own lives, so that we can make our mark and put our signature on our work. And he was doing that in the construction field. And so his signature was all over the work that he did, whether it was a garage that he was building on the weekend for someone. He always tried to do something just a little bit different, maybe put an extra piece of trim up on the corners, and maybe add a different element that the contractor wasn't even expecting. So we know that it's in the arts, but it's also beyond the arts too. So what we're trying to say is that it's in math, it's in engineering, it's in technology, and it is in art as well. So we can't just limit ourselves. The ultimate takeaway for our first myth here is that creativity is for everyone. We all have the capacity to think and ask what if, and to maybe break the mold. And so what we have to do is get rid of that very harmful myth that maybe it's just these art type kids, in the art class. It's not, it's so much bigger than that. And so let's take a look at our next myth. really kind of stacks on this one. This idea called the Eureka myth. The Eureka myth is this idea that you'll just wake up one day and you'll have this brilliant idea. And that is perpetuated mostly in pop culture, the stories that we tell, when in reality, creative breakthroughs and creative thinking, it actually takes quite a bit of time. And so let's dig into this second one for us today. So, one of the most legendary sketch shows of the last decade is the Key and Peele show. So, these sketches are just iconic now. And what we find is that these things did not just happen overnight. They just didn't come up with these landmark sketches that are socially biting and educative at the same time. But really, behind the mask there, if you look inside how they wrote all this, you can see from this little excerpt how much work went into it. So they didn't just wake up and say, oh, I've got a sketch that's just going to be brilliant. When in fact, here's how it really worked. So according to the writing team for the Key and Peele show, every year, they say, we started the writing process by casting the widest net possible, including any idea that intrigued us. We typically wrote 5 times as many sketches as we needed. 5 times as many ideas is what we actually ended up using. See, the Eureka myth is harmful because we either watch a show, we see a story that's not quite true, that you'll just have this flash of genius. And so one of the most prominent examples of that is from the legendary Back to the Future film. So if you remember this film, the Doc Brown character basically falls and hits his head, and he says, that's when I had my idea for the flux capacitor, this thing that makes the time machine work. But what you really forget, though, when you're watching the movie is that he's an old man. He's been thinking about the notion of time travel like for his entire career. He's been running it over in his head, either explicitly or sort of in an incubation way, like in his subconscious for decades, right? But the movie makes it seem like, oh, boom, I'll hit my head and I'll have this flash of genius. Or in our case, we'll wake up one morning and we'll have the fix to this thing we've never even really thought about. And so the myth of the eureka moment is harmful in many ways because it discounts how much thinking goes into a creative breakthrough. And so we've got our breed myth. We know that everyone has the capacity to be creative, to carry that Promethean flame forward. And we know that thinking takes a great deal of thinking to actually break through and have a creative idea that works, something that's worthy of pursuit. And then our third myth is the lone creator myth. This one is also really harmful because it comes from stories we tell each other, and almost every creative breakthrough you can think of, all the way back to the beginning of time, was done in a team. But the story is better if we can just say that there was this lone genius alone in a room working tirelessly, and then they have this breakthrough and they do it all alone. When almost always that's a myth. That's almost always not the case. So creativity is a team sport. That's what we want to take away here. And so we go back to Doc Brown, but don't forget, oh, there's the other part of the team. We can't forget about Marty. They actually did this together. So even in the films, we kind of perpetuate certain myths, but we have to remind ourselves of the teamwork element that is the true core of creative breakthroughs and creative thinking. So let's do another example. So maybe one of the most prominent myths about the lone creator goes back to Edison himself. So Thomas Edison did have these breakthroughs, but he definitely did not do it alone. But the story is better if we just have this lone genius who created the light bulb in the dark, in a room with a bunch of messy tables, and using his, I think he says he used 10,000 filaments to try to get it right for the light bulb. But in truth, if you read about it, his team behind the breakthrough was called the muckers, and meaning they just mucked around in the sort of office spaces there. And they were an interdisciplinary team of experts from different fields who were constantly helping him get that patent, get it to work, and get it to the market. So you've got people from engineering, you get people working on the mechanics side alongside with Edison. But as we get further removed from the initial invention story, we tell that story falsely again and again. And somehow it ends up that Thomas Edison was this lone genius and he did it all by himself. And it's almost never the case. In fact, on a side note, someone else filed a patent for the same type of invention on the same day, only mere hours later. They didn't know it about each other. So there were actually multiple teams crusading for the same breakthrough. How can we get this thing called the light bulb, or how can we make electricity work in a reasonable way for folks to use? So it's really almost never the case that someone did it alone without any help. It's almost always a team effort if you really dig into the true part of the story. So we have this breed myth. We know that we all have the capacity. We know it takes a lot of time to think, and we know that we need help. We need help to make a breakthrough. And here's our next one, the constraints myth. One of the more persistent myths out there is that if we want to be creative, we can just let people go free. We can just set them loose, let them go wild. When in fact, the constraints placed on people is what makes them innovate and what makes them bend and stretch and, of course, break the box. And you hear that phrase, think outside the box. Well, how can we have a moment of thinking outside the box if there's no box, if there's no constraints to push back against, if there's no constraints to stretch and then hopefully shatter one day? So the constraints myth is powerful. And of course, I believed it for a long, long time, but actually under the tighter constraints, you're forced to shift and move and innovate and borrow from other domains, borrow from other knowledge pieces and knowledge sets to then break through and solve the problem and then win the game or win the war in certain cases. So let's take some examples there on the constraints myth. So we all remember this scene from Apollo 13. And of course, the film does it so well. We know that they're stranded up there, and here we are down here. And I remember being in the theater watching this, and of course, just sweating, thinking, what are they going to do? And don't forget, this was a true story. And so they just only have so many materials. So down there in the Houston Center there, they say, we absolutely have a problem. And they say, okay, here's the stuff they have. Let's figure it out, because if we don't, and I remember that iconic line, he basically says, not on my watch, So they have this sort of army of mathematicians and engineers sprawling out these random disparate parts that are stuck up in the shuttle with them in space. And then they have to decide, with this, how can we get them home? And under those tremendous constraints, they had to use all of their knowledge, all of their expertise in brand new ways to conjure up something that will get these people home. And so that's one of my favorite examples to show you how under the tightest constraints, that's when we get to be the most innovative and most creative in our thinking, in our actions, in our teaming. And so that's another true story, of course. And one that's really relevant right now in this moment is Jonas Salk. So Jonas Salk's story goes back to his own sort of breakthrough thinking using the what if and maybe mindset when he was in school to learn medicine. He was training for science. And he basically asks his own teacher, who was the expert at the time, well, why can't we do it this way? And what he was asking about was how to solve the polio crisis. And so my grandparents were terrified because they had children they were worried about in the 1950s who might contract polio. So an entire generation of parents were just terrified that their children might get this scary thing, this very real and debilitating thing called polio. And so he's asking the question in this what if way to his professor. He's asking, well, why can't we do it this way? And what he's saying is, why can't we use a dead strain and then treat it against it? And he's actually advocating for what became sort of virology. And the professor says, no, you can't do that. And he says, well, why? And he says, well, you just can't. It was inconceivable to the professor that something like that could work. So Salk does it anyway, only a matter of years later. And so under these tremendous constraints, we have this polio crisis. We have limited knowledge. We have limited resources. He decides to ask what if and work directly in the face of those constraints. And he saves a generation of children. And of course, his work is still now being celebrated. And of course, around the world, we use his foundation of the polio vaccine to help children everywhere. And really the bottom line was, under these constraints, how can I say what if and stretch against them and break through? And so here we are in this pandemic fighting. So we have all of our myths laid out for you. And here's our last one. And there are many more, but these are the ones we wanted to kind of focus on for the presentation for today. The final one is called the mousetrap myth. And this one's really interesting because essentially what we're saying is, if I've got a eureka idea overnight, that's all I need. And I've just got it trapped and I've got it in my hands, and then everything's going to be fine. And you know what? I'm going to be a millionaire tomorrow. And in fact, the mousetrap myth, this feeling of I've got my idea in my hands, Actually, the truth of it is now the hard work begins. Once you get your idea, the journey toward making the creative breakthrough actually happen for real is the real work. And so a lot of us are so disappointed when we have a great idea and then we find about the efforts it's going to go to, the failures involved, the tinkering, the prototyping, and getting it out to the world. That's really the frustrating part. So one of the most harmful myths is that I'll get this idea overnight and then it'll be great. When in fact, the journey, the long and zigzag path toward that breakthrough being for real is only beginning. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. So the Post-it note. The Post-it note was derived from an idea from someone who worked at 3M, the big manufacturing engineering company. And the person basically said, I've got some paper that doesn't quite stick very well. And yeah, nobody cared because they could not see why that would be a good idea. And so he's tinkering. And for a few years, he just can't quite figure out what he's even come up with. And then his buddy that works with him, he also happens to preach on the weekends. And he says one day out of nowhere, I'm just so mad I can't keep my marks and my notes in my pages to stay while I'm preaching and flipping back and forth. And then his buddy thinks, well, I've got this paper that doesn't quite stick very well. And they thought, oh my goodness, we are on to something. So guess what? They buddy up, they work together to then, over another matter of years, before anybody even cared about that idea. And so over about a 12-year period, from the very initial idea getting trapped to actually you getting it on the shelf, it's almost over a decade of time. Now that kind of tenacity and persistence and discipline, that's really the truth about getting a creative idea from your head and out into the world. And I think the real breakthrough came when one day, I think it was a manager walking by at 3M just happened to see one of these notes laying out, and no one was there. So he happened to just write a little message on it and stick it. And when they returned and saw it, they thought, oh, that's what that's for. So they didn't even know what that was, even the purpose of the Post-it note, until someone randomly wrote a little note on it because they missed the person at their office. And that only fueled their fire even more to go out and make this a real thing in the real world. And so we have the Post-it note example. And then, of course, we can't leave a creativity presentation without talking about my man Prince, the legendary Prince. And so he was under tremendous technological constraints in his own creating and searching for that ultimate sound. And so he's under the constraints for an idea that he wants, and he's trying to search for that ultimate sound. And he's got it in his head. He says, I want to make a drum sound that no one else has heard. In fact, that no one else can even replicate. In fact, how did he do it? He used this Lin 1 drum computer. And what this computer is, it's pre-programmed with hundreds and hundreds of different drum sounds. But he doesn't want a pre-programmed sound. He wants one that no one's ever heard before. So he's got this idea trapped in his head. Like, how can I get this iconic sound? And then he has to tinker and prototype and dabble all the way to that sound that he's dreaming of in his head. So what does he do? He decides to take this Lin drum machine and he turns it around. This is the back of the Lin 1 drum machine. And he starts to think, what if I just start plugging random other pieces of musical equipment into this piece of musical equipment that were never designed to be connected there in the first place? So he's got his idea. He keeps tinkering. And he says, well, what if I take my guitar pedals that are supposed to take my guitar sound and alter it and make it sound a different way? What if I ran those pedals through the back of that machine, and would it work? And yes, it did. No one had ever thought to run a guitar pedal through a drum machine. And that's how you get what people now call the drum knock, or the door knock sound that opens to songs like When Doves Cry. It sounds like, and that's the sound that almost everybody for the next 10 years tried to steal and tried to replicate. And that's why that sound is so popular from about 1983 on into the late 80s. And so he had this idea in his head, and it took hours and hours and hours of practice and tinkering to get to that sound that he wanted. So the trap is one of the biggest myths, is that once we get our idea, everything's going to be great. When in fact, the failure involved, the tinkering involved, is only the thing that lays ahead of you. And you've got to be able to lean into that and use that and see it as a good thing. And that's where we'll end here with this idea of failure being the creative thinker's best friend. And so my wife was reading this YA series by Pierce Brown, and she stopped reading to show me a quote that he wrote in his prologue to the readers. And it absolutely struck me. And I've been using it in almost everything I can present here lately over about the last year. And it's really transformational for me. And I'd like to share that with you. So, failure being the creative thinker's best friend. So, let's take a look from Pierce Brown. He says to his readers, everything grand is made from a series of ugly little moments. All the works of people you and I admire sit atop a foundation of failures. And that's exactly right. That is exactly true. People have spent so many hours, so many years trying to perfect this thing they've been working on. And it takes so many tries and errors and so many zigs and zags to get to that thing that you had in your head and making it real. And so that's where I want to leave us today with a final reading recommendation. And it is, in fact, this book called Zigzag by Keith Sawyer. In fact, any type of thinking towards something of a breakthrough or a creative moment is a zigzag path. It will not be linear. And too often our school is built in a linear fashion. The way that we work in our business, we try to linearize it. When in fact, life is a zigzag. And think of how you got to where you are today. How many twists and turns. So if you really want to dig in, the subtitle there, The Surprising Path to Greater Creativity, this is a great read for all of us. It doesn't matter if we're teaching or leading a business or running an art gallery. It's all about the zigzag. And so today we have this moment to dive into several different myths. Just remember that we all have a creative capacity. And we want to make sure that we know that after leaving this today. It doesn't matter what you're interested in, what domain, creativity is for everyone. All right. Thank you guys so much. It will open up to any questions you've got, any kind of discussion. And I thank you for being here. Yes, the Prince add in. You got to have it. If you talk about creativity, you got to have it. Thanks for putting some things in the chat there for us. Eye-opening for many disciplines. Yes, that's right. We cannot let this be just an arts conversation. That's certainly the push for STEAM, is to include the arts, but also to show that the artistic way of thinking is the same way of thinking that we do in mathematics, and the idea of what ifing and saying, well, maybe we could do it this way. Maybe we could build this building that way. So yes, absolutely. Remember that STEAM festival notion of all of those domains being wrapped together is the big takeaway here. And creativity is at the heart of all those domains, all those disciplines. And like we said, there's my contact info. If you ever need anything, you want to have a little conversation about how to make your real estate firm more creative, or your classroom, it doesn't matter to me. You just give me an email there and I'll come running. So thank you all. And I hope you enjoy the STEAM Festival events that are all around the 3 sort of regions we've built out for you. And I'm grateful to be part of this. So we'll go ahead and end the session here. Thank you, guys.